Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are about to begin our second plenary session, during which you will hear various perspectives on the same challenge. Our first speaker will provide spiritual insights into a crisis that affects us all. Please join me in welcoming Mr. János Zlinszky.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, most of us in this room are painfully aware of the possibility, not to say likelihood, of a widespread non-compliance with the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. It's not something we wish for, let alone advocate for, but a precautionary approach to our long-term future requires the contemplation of a worst-case scenario as well. The evaluation of our future options remaining and our subsequent behavior will greatly depend on our innermost convictions or our value system, the central paradigm of our lives. It is this paradigm that will produce the system on which our organized reaction to the changing realities will depend. So I should think it's well worth getting acquainted with the foundations of the most important value systems and paradigms, to learn what's at the center, at the heart of the reactions of different communities to the same crisis, the same or at least similar changes. This desire is behind my effort to very briefly, too concisely in fact, highlight two important elements of the Christian approach to the ecological crisis. Or actually, more honestly, the roots of the behavior Christians ought to display in relation with the ecological crisis. But first of all, let us quickly remind ourselves what we mean in this context by ecological crisis, quoting a few emblematic reports. I propose that this term has two layers at least, two stages in causal relationship with each other. Strictly speaking, the term means the deterioration and collapse of large subsystems of the global ecosystem, in simplest terms called nature. Well, there are different ways and means to identify these large subsystems, and this is one example for that. We see here some of the large systems, very different in composition, location, function. I mean, you see the well-known things like the Amazon forest or the tundra or the Tibetan plateau or the Antarctic region and many others. They are very different in composition, location, and function, but they are similar in being connected with each other, connected to each other, and therefore they are often called dominoes. Big dominoes. They share the characteristic of being capable of tipping, which means an abrupt change of their equilibrium range and equilibrium status. In another emblematic paper about the planetary boundaries, we have a different logic for these subsystems. Many will be familiar with that, and you can read on climate change, oceans, ozone layer, freshwater biodiversity, and so on. And this emblematic study estimated the tipping pressures for some of these subsystems. And we know that actually this study is regularly updated as research evolves. And during the last 15 years, more and more of these thresholds were passed. And in 2022, we already have 6 of the 9 subsystems in the red. We deserve a reminder that this degradation should not have come as a surprise. Already the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment warned that practically all drivers of degradation in ecosystem services in most types of ecosystems are growing in intensity. These are the types of ecosystems here, and here are the different drivers. And the arrows indicate a constant pressure or an increasing pressure. There's but one arrow that goes slightly downwards. It's tedious to find it. What we have here as drivers of degradation is climate change, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and so on and so forth. So these are the living stocks of nature. These are renewable natural capital, if you want. But it's not only renewable natural capital running out. The non-renewables are also getting scarce. And in this figure, you have these pink columns, which indicate, which are proportional to the remaining years some rare earth metals are estimated to have. And those of you familiar with foreign policy know that these metals are now politely called conflict minerals. Well, Pope Francis is actually not mincing his words as he describes the overall picture in his Santa Cruz address in 2015, just after the issuing of Laudato Si. And I just read it out. Time, my brothers and sisters, is running out. We are not yet tearing one another apart, but we are tearing apart our common home. Today, the scientific community realizes what the poor have told us long ago. Harm, perhaps irreversible harm, is being done to the ecosystem. The Earth, entire peoples, and individual persons are being brutally punished. The Earth, entire peoples, and individual persons. And here we have the connection to the second definition of ecological crisis, detrimental changes in ecological framework conditions of human life. Well, because as we see from this pyramid of policy development, the natural resources form the very basis of the well-being pyramid. Their quality and quantity are the sine qua non for the functioning of the whole man-made superstructure, be it material or spiritual. Ultimately, we are watching this. We are aiming towards well-being. We are watching the systems which immediately produce, if I may use this word, well-being. I mean, you can get the horse to the water, but cannot make him drink. So you cannot force well-being on anyone. But you can create conditions. But conditions also need preconditions, and intermediate ends need means, and yet again, more fundamental means. These layers, the subsystems, are not at all of equal power and influence. And these are, by the way, simple realities most economists and politicians staunchly refuse to face or accept. The bad news is that if we look at the well-known symbol of the donut of a safe and just political space, from the outside, safe from ecological collapse, and from the inside, just being over the threshold of the minimum of human rights required for a life in dignity. So if we look at this donut of a safe and just political space, we can and have to sadly remind ourselves that social thresholds are respected and secured even less than the economical boundaries are. So as we are facing the problem with trespassing economic boundaries, we are facing this in a society which is suffering proportionally, maybe even more. Well, we have different forms of capital in our national wealth. We can rely on if we want to deal with our problems. And here what we look at is basically the forms of natural capital shown in a very simplified way, nested, as a nested system. They are interdependent, of course, but they are far from equal influence on each other. They form a nested system. And this nesting defines the ultimate hierarchy between the subsystems. And ultimately, it's the nest outside, i.e. nature, which rules and which has the last word. And of course, this is exactly what is reflected very well in the well-known business as usual run of the World Tree model described by Limits to Growth. And here you see between 1900 and basically the present, the trends of key variables in a world pursuing the continuous acceleration of goods production. So here you see the stock of non-renewable resources. That's the trends of change. Forget about the numerical values. The trends of change, that's important. Non-renewables, industrial goods, exponential growth of them, exponential growth of population, food production evening out already, as you see, and the accumulation of persistent pollutant in the world. So what you see here is actually, and that's the frightening thing, what you see here is not just the figure produced by the model in 1972, or actually during the rerun of the model in 2004. But looking back, basically, it's the reality produced by ourselves. We are on track, but that's a bad news. And for a while, you know, you get what you are governing for. You are governing for exponential industrial growth, so you get what you are governing for. But then soon, there will be detrimental changes in the ecological framework conditions of human life. And these detrimental changes start to bring down the number of people quite decisively. The collapse of ecosystems, including, of course, the agricultural ecosystems, causes the collapse of the food system, human populations, and the industrial system. So here we have the twin definitions. The collapse of large subsystems of the global ecosystem, meaning detrimental changes in the ecological framework conditions of human life. And this is exactly what the Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope John Paul were talking already in the year 2002. We are concerned about the negative consequences for humanity and for all creation, resulting from the degradation of some basic natural resources, such as water, air, and land, brought about by an economic and technological progress which does not recognize and take into account its limits, the limits to growth. So, soon after the publication of his encyclical letter to jump 1.5 decades, Pope Francis used actually a much more strong and decisive language in his Santa Cruz address, talking about the same issue. He says that our common home is being pillaged, laid waste, and harmed with impunity. Cowardice in defending it is a grave sin of omission, as we heard it already. We see with growing disappointment how one international summit after another takes place without any significant result. There exists a clear, definite, and pressing ethical imperative to implement what has not yet been done. People and their movements are called to cry out, to mobilize, to demand peacefully but firmly that appropriate and urgently needed measures be taken. I ask you in the name of God to defend Mother Earth. So, strong language indeed. But there's a question of, is this strong language an outlier? Or, on the contrary, is it a crescendo of many instruments playing already in unison from all directions? The following table actually serves as a mere indication, just a hint, a sample, to illustrate the fact that all Christian denominations have a long history of considering the issue of the integrity of creation and offering faith-based reflections on the crisis. This table indicates authoritative statements of Christian denominations on the social and the ecological crises. And their dates, as you see, stretch from 1891 till 2015. And the statements, guidances, teachings, calls, programs come from ecumenical bodies, councils, bishops' conferences of the Calvinist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Evangelical, Orthodox, Catholic churches, all over the place. But, of course, for the sake of timekeeping, I will try to only bring a few original quotes from these to underline the perspective I would like to convey. So, coming to the conclusions, why should we care so much about nature? And there are, I would actually list two of these reasons. There are many reasons launched from a Christian thinking, but certainly one of them is the intrinsic value of nature. This has a biblical basis as well. Throughout the Old Testament, this divine grandeur and beauty of nature is met with much awe and wonder, and it brings forth admiration and praise for the creator and owner. To quote but a few lines, "The sea belongs to him, the dry land, for he made it. He calls each one of the stars by their name. He knows every bird in the air. All forest creatures are his, the animals on the mountains in their thousands. How lovely all his works, how dazzling to the eye. Also, he has not made anything imperfect. He's wearing the light as a robe, stretches out the heavens like a tent, has his palace on the waters, the clouds are his chariot. Everything has been made for a purpose. They never desert their duties, being at his service. The Lord loves everything that exists." So everything created belongs to God. God knows every creature by his name. They are all perfect. They all have their purpose. They are all at his service. And God loves everything what exists. The relationship of creator and creation is one of ownership, acquaintance, perfection, purpose, obedience, and love. This then is the biblical status of creation, and this is a status of great dignity and value indeed. Now, the second reason or explanation concerns the role and responsibility of the human person, how we perceive this role and responsibility. Actually, the Catechism of the Catholic Church uses unusually strong language as it protects the integrity of nature versus people. It says that the use of the mineral, vegetable, and animal resources of the universe cannot be divorced from respect for moral imperatives. The man's dominion over beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come, and it requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. That sounds really like idolatry, doesn't it? It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. We have reminders to that in the encyclical Laudato Si, of course, which is sort of a Lonely Planet guide for us to rediscover the dignity of creation and our human responsibility. It is an appeal, actually, for a joint action for the sake of our common home. And it reminds us of very important aspects, again, of our relations with nature. One of these is the central role of beauty. It says that the relationship between a good aesthetic education and the maintenance of a healthy environment cannot be overlooked. By learning to see and appreciate beauty, we learn to reject self-interested pragmatism. If someone has not learned to stop and admire something beautiful, we should not be surprised if he or she treats everything as an object to be used and abused without scruple. The second such reminder is about the intrinsic value of creatures. We are reminded of the intrinsic dignity of the world. We are warned against looking at creation as mere raw material. And I quote, "The technological mind sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. It views the cosmos similarly as a mere space into which objects can be thrown with complete indifference. The intrinsic dignity of the world is thus compromised." The third such very important notion, principle, we are reminded of is the priority of being over the priority of usefulness. He says, together with our obligation to use the earth's goods responsibly, we are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. We can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. And finally, there's the important fraternity between all creatures, the fraternity of all creatures. When our hearts are authentically open to universal communion, this sense of fraternity excludes nothing and no one. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and cannot be treated individually. Thus, the beauty, the value of being, fraternity of all creatures, they are all contributing to the intrinsic dignity nature has and the role and responsibility people have. And this role and responsibility of the human person has been laid down very concisely, very clearly, very powerfully by what I already mentioned, the Declaration on Environmental Ethics by Pope John Paul II and Patriarch Bartholomew, so in an ecumenical Orthodox Catholic declaration. In 2002, actually, right before the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development. And it talks about us as stewards, talks about the mandate given to us to collaborate with God in watching over creation in holiness and wisdom. It says that if we examine carefully the social and environmental crisis which the world community is facing, we must conclude that we are betraying the mandate God has given us to be stewards called to collaborate with God in watching over creation in holiness and wisdom. And therefore, what is required is an act of repentance on our part. We must regain humility and recognize the limits of our powers, the limits of our knowledge and judgment. And we have to be inspired by environmentally ethical behavior, which fosters interdependence and stresses the principles of universal solidarity. For our problem is not simply economic and technological. It is a moral and spiritual problem. And the solution at the economic and technological level can be only found if we undergo in the most radical way an inner change of heart, which can then lead us to a change in lifestyle and of the change of unsustainable patterns of our consumption and production. And it says that, reminds us that Christians and all other believers actually have a specific role to play in proclaiming moral values and in educating people in ecological awareness. But ecological awareness manifests itself in responsibility towards self, towards others, towards creation. We will have to think of the world's children when we reflect on and evaluate our options for action. And it is the love for our children that will show us the path that we must follow in the future. I'm still quoting. We have to be humble regarding the idea of ownership and to be open to the demands of solidarity, another heretic statement. For the demands of justice and charity to be respected, the most affluent societies must carry the greater burden. From them is demanded a greater sacrifice. On the basis of the principle of subsidiarity, all religions, governments, institutions can take on some task, some part of the shared effort. And we must promote among ourselves a peaceful approach to disagreement about how to live on this earth, how to share it, how to use it, about what to change and what to leave unchanged. It is not too late. God's word has incredible healing powers. So this is the message from the churches. This is a Christian perspective on this is part of the Christian perspective on the ecological crisis. And I would leave you with this thought and thank you for your attention.